Et donc j'ai dessiné en disant « Je suis Charlie ». Et ça, c'est une idée que j'avais dans la tête, mais c'était pas suffisant. Ça faisait pas une. Et puis il n'y avait plus que ce jus-là. Il n'y avait plus que cette idée de dessiner Mahomet. Je suis Charlie. Et je l'ai regardé. Il était en train de pleurer. Et puis, au-dessus, j'ai écrit « Tout est pardonné ». Puis j'ai pleuré. Et c'était la une.
Welcome back, I'm Marissa Semkiw. Well, there is no doubt this issue of Charlie Hebdo is the most anticipated one yet. The weekly magazine, due to be published tomorrow, will feature Muhammad on the cover, a rather bold statement after the deadly attacks that left 12 dead. The magazine is planned to print up to 3 million copies. Sun News contributor J.J. McCullough joins me now from Vancouver to discuss the controversial cover. J.J., I saw this cover and I thought, wow, what a bold statement on the part of Charlie Hebdo in light of everything that they've gone through over the course of the last week. What was your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just such a brilliant, such a magnificent cover on so many different levels. I mean, it strikes this marvelous balance between being conciliatory and being provocative. So, of course, you have the prophet Muhammad, who's being depicted, and that unto itself is a controversial gesture. So on that ground, they're showing that they're not backing down, that they're going to be provocative, that they're going to continue to fight for free expression in this very particularized manifestation. But then at the same time, the prophet is holding up the Je suis Charlie sign, and then at the top it says, we forgive. And so it's, again, like, it's a kind of, what it's doing in part is really reinforcing the idea that this magazine is not hateful. It's not about hating Muslims. It's never been about hating Muslims. It's always been a very playful magazine that insults, aspects of modern society that the cartoonists feel are preposterous in some way, and sort of poking fun at those who take themselves too seriously. And that is really, I think, what the magazine is doubling down on with this particular message. I mean, they have really nothing to apologize for, but I think it really reflects quite something quite favorable on their generosity of spirit, that they're willing to sort of take this kind of good-natured ribbing as opposed to something a little bit more sharp-edged, perhaps.
They didn't back down. They doubled down. But I'm curious what you think the message "all is forgiven" really means. Sort of, I think it's open to interpretation. I've heard a couple of different interpretations, but your take, especially as a cartoonist.
Yeah, well, I mean, by "all is forgiven," I think that they're trying to sort of poke fun in a number of different ways. And I mean, this is, excuse me, it's quite broad, so you can kind of interpret it in a number of ways. I think that what they're trying to do is that I think they're pushing back against a bit of the narrative that that they themselves kind of brought this attack on, which is a line that you've heard in some corners. And they're sort of saying that all is forgiven, we forgive Islam for provoking or for instigating this attack, but that's sort of, we're also kind of being apologetic ourselves, and we're sort of conceding that perhaps it's not actually Islam, and that we're portraying the prophet in this kind of sympathetic line. So I mean, it is ambiguous, and I think it's ambiguous on purpose, because a number of different people can interpret it in a number of different ways. But I do think that the overall intent is to do something that comes off, at least on first glance, as being conciliatory and not being hostile to Muslims, though at the same time, as I said, also standing up for the right of free expression and not backing down from the desire to draw whatever it is they want to draw.
The goal of these terrorists, of course, is to stoke fear, to not allow images of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, depicted in these satirical ways in cartoons. This is a magazine. The interesting thing, narrative sort of, is that this is a magazine that previously sold 40,000 copies a week. Now they're publishing 3 million. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, obviously interest has skyrocketed dramatically in this magazine since the tragedy, which of course is very unfortunate. But I do think people are curious about it. I mean, I myself was a fan of the magazine before it was actually in the headline. So, and I mean, I was always very aware that it is, I mean, it's a small-time publication. I mean, these kind of magazines are quite popular in Europe, but they generally have pretty low circulation. They're printed on cheap paper. They're just kind of full of, sort of scurrilous sort of cartoons. I mean, they don't necessarily have a broad sort of currency in the broader popular culture. But now, of course, to own a copy of Charlie Hebdo will be interpreted as being a sort of political statement. I mean, you can buy a copy by having it sort of lying around your living room. You're basically saying that you're taking a very particular politicized stance on this issue of freedom of speech, on this issue of how we're going to engage with the Muslim world, particularly in regards to their sort of standards for decorum versus our own standards in the non-Muslim world about sort of being equal opportunity offenders. So I mean, it's a very clever PR move on the part of the magazine, but they're also really rising to the occasion. You know, history has sort of assigned them to sort of to carry the heavy burden of being a sort of cipher for the virtue of freedom of speech, and I think it's quite heroic that they're making their magazine so widely distributed, not only in France, but in other parts of Europe, and probably in this continent as well, because I do think that it's important that we have symbols, and I think it's important that people are able to embrace symbols in this kind of way. I mean, I myself, I'd be keen to get a copy if I can pull that off.
This magazine pushed the limits of free speech. That's why so many people died last week. I'm curious, given how central this image now is to the story, how important these images are to the story over the course of the last 7 days, will it continue to offend some, and will there be those that continue to choose not to publish it?
Yes, and this is why I think that the cover is so brilliant, not only because of sort of the image analysis that we were engaged in earlier, but also because just by merely producing a cover with a picture of the Prophet Muhammad on it, you're sort of demanding that the rest of the mainstream media sort of take a position on it. I mean, everybody's been talking a really good game about freedom of speech and Je suis Charlie and all the rest of it, but now, you know, sort of the gamut has been thrown down. I mean, now the mainstream media has to decide whether or not they're going to publish images of this very newsworthy magazine cover, or whether or not, you know, now that their bluff is being called, whether or not they're actually going to retreat, and actually they are in fact too cowardly to actually publicize a contentious image. You know, before they could say, oh, well, you know, we don't want to offend, we don't want to do anything that's intentionally provocative, but now you have this very dramatic, newsworthy event in which a magazine that was, you know, had a number of its top staff slaughtered in protest of their treatment of the Muslim world, have now doubled down and said, no, we're actually going to continue to provoke in this kind of way. And the question is whether or not the rest of the mainstream media is going to follow suit, is actually going to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. So I do think it was quite brilliant the way that they've provoked, and already we're seeing the mainstream media divided in regards of whether or not they're actually willing to publish or show images of this very historic cover.
I want to get your reaction to a response to the massacre by a French satirical newspaper, by a French newspaper rather, Le Journal de Montréal. I think we have an image of it. It's sort of it's a connect the dot image of Muhammad, and I think it's clever because viewers who don't like to see these sort of satirical images of Muhammad don't need to connect the dots, but those that want to see the satirical image of Muhammad can connect the dots. What do you think about this approach?
I think it's quite brilliant. It's very meta in a very sort of charming kind of way, because you get into this question of, well, what really is a depiction of Muhammad? Like, if you have to finish the drawing yourself, is it a depiction yet? I mean, is it only a depiction when you complete it, or is it a depiction when it's just the dots? I mean, I remember when the Danish cartoons were all in the public discourse, there was a lot of sort of fun meta commentary. You know, people would draw a fire hydrant and they would say, oh, it looks like a fire hydrant. Actually, it's a picture of Muhammad. Does that offend you? You know, this kind of thing. But I do think what I do give the cartoonist particular kudos for, and what I give the newspaper particular kudos for in publishing this, is that, you know, it's one thing to merely publish somebody else's cartoon. It's one thing to do what I was just discussing and, you know, just put on your newscast an image of somebody else's Muhammad cartoon because you can say it's a newsworthy event. It's something very different altogether to throw more fuel on the fire, so to speak, by actually adding, by actually creating something new, by actually creating something yourself that's intentionally provocative or at least is engaged with this discourse. And this is something that I feel the cartoonist community has been quite not particularly respectable in that a number of cartoonists have drawn, you know, heroic pictures about cartoonists wielding pens and stabbing terrorists with their pencils and whatnot, but very few cartoonists have been willing to be provocative in the way that the Charlie Hebdo people died for. And I think it's quite heroic that this particular newspaper is I believe, truly honoring the legacy of Charlie Hebdo's slain editors by, again, by doing something provocative and by doing something that they know will rile the sensibilities of a number of Muslims.
And as a cartoonist yourself, JJ, I know you have been as equally provocative. I want to thank you for your time. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
For more stories, check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/The Sun News Network. We're not